You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Leanne Brooke-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. The next Waking the Wild Crucible to open will be Waking the Wild Sovereign in early 2023. It always sells out. So if you are feeling the call to sovereignty and actualizing your inner king or queen archetype, then do go register your interest now and you'll be the first to hear when it opens for application. The link for that is at primalhappiness.co/WTWS. And now onto this week's show. It's with Daniel Pinchbeck. Daniel is the New York Times bestselling author of Breaking Open the Head, When Plants Dream, and more. He hosted the talk show Mind Shit on Gaia TV and was featured in the 2010 documentary 2012 Time for Change. He has written for many publications, including the New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, and much, much more. He is the director of Liminal.news, an online course platform, and publishes a regular newsletter. In this conversation, Daniel and I explored the fascinating topic of DMT, also known as the spirit molecule. We covered what DMT is, its history, research that's done about it, and how Daniel sees its role in human consciousness and the challenges of the world today. This was such a deep, rich, and wide-ranging conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really think you will too. Let's dive in. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Leanne. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've been really looking at the breadth and depth of your work, and I'm really interested to see how this kind of starting point of what I'm really intrigued to explore around DMT, how it will weave into lots and lots of different areas. I can already see like your experience is so broad. I think it's going to take us some interesting places. But first, I would love to know what's taking you to explore what is, some really eclectic subjects that aren't particularly mainstream, aren't typically average. What took you here? Where did this passion arise from?
Do you want the short, medium, long, or extremely long version?
I'll go for medium, please.
I grew up in Manhattan in New York, and my parents were artists, but everybody, there was a sort of no spirituality in a way. Like my dad meditated a little bit, but there was a sense of, materialism, scientific materialism was very much seems what was real. And therefore, along with that was this idea that consciousness was only based, it's like an epiphenomenon of sort of brain activity, kind of this random evolutionary process, and that after we passed away, that would be it. Everything was just annihilated into this infinite black void. And as I got older, I know this didn't sit well with me. And I began to wonder, was there, anything else or any other way to think about anything else? So that I reminded myself that I had these psychedelic experiences when I was in college for a few years that were very profound and were the only, mystical experiences I had had. So I decided that I would explore psychedelics. This was in my late 20s, I guess. And I started to I was a journalist, I was writing for magazines, so I started to get some assignments I ended up going to Gabon in Africa to take Iboga, which is West African psychedelic. It's being used a lot to treat addiction, sometimes called ibogaine. And then I also got an assignment to go to visit the Ecuador to work with a tribe called the Sequoia and take ayahuasca. And then I also went to the Burning Man Festival for Rolling Stone. I wrote about that back in 2000. And I just had all these extraordinary experiences with these shamanic substances that over time began to change my worldview because, I would have psychic experiences, paranormal experiences, many different things would happen. And so, that sort of led me to write the first book, Breaking Open the Head, which ended up sort of being my conversion story in a way from materialism to shamanism to Jungian archetypal psychology or something. And that book also encompassed my first experiences, both with ayahuasca that contains dimethyltryptamine and also with DMT just in a smokable form. And that book led me to a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, looking at, because turns out that a lot of indigenous cultures around the world have prophecies, understanding of this time, which I think are seeming more and more compelling, considering where we're going on every level. And so I wrote the book about prophecies, and it was basically, understanding that these like visionary plants that these indigenous cultures thought were very important were actually very important, and that there was something wrong with our modern civilization that couldn't see the value in these types of experiences. And of course, that's changed now. Now there's a big psychedelic renaissance happening, which I think my first book, Breaking Open the Head, kind of helped instigate. So now we have like How to Change Your Mind on Netflix, and a lot of billions of dollars going into research, the psychedelics, and so on. It was an interesting moment for that field. And then from there, I got into other areas. I was very concerned around the ecological crisis back in 2000, and going back to 2002, actually, to the first book. So after 2012, I started a company called Evolver, and we tried to build like a local community movement. And then I wrote a third book that came out from Watkins Press, an English press, in 2016, called How Soon Is Now, which was an effort to kind of think through all the elements of systems change that would have to happen, kind of radically for us to be able to deal with this ecological emergency that we were facing. I had like Sting and Russell Brand write introductions to that book. Didn't really pick up. It felt like people weren't really able to think in a system design way about the system. So since then, I wrote another book about ayahuasca with my friend Sophia Roklhin, an anthropologist, called When Plants Dream. And I write a newsletter, teach courses, and do whatever else comes along.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I was thinking, as you were talking, you've got what most people or many people listening would consider a dream job, having these incredible experiences and getting paid to have them and write about them. And then I was also thinking, it's I'm not an expert at all on journalism, so I'm just assuming that it's, I guess in journalism, there's, I guess sometimes a degree of objectivity that's valued, but when you're immersing yourself in these kinds of experiences, you can't help but be transformed by them. So I'm thinking that must be a particularly interesting, going into these experiences that are shamanic and transformative in nature. They're going to like very much be the spirit of what you're writing, aren't they? You're not able to keep that kind of sort of journalistic objectivity in the same way.
Right. Well, yes, there sort of became a whole genre, which I wrote some early sort of examples of like people exploring shamanism and writing about it for mainstream publications, like sort of a self-mocking humor, kind of like a self-distancing from the experience. Ultimately, I'd say after I published my second book, where I was very solidly on the side of kind of the prophetic wisdom traditions and the mystery school wisdom and all that kind of stuff. by then it was very difficult for me to write anymore for the mainstream publications because they have a kind of materialist ethos in a way.
Yes, it just doesn't fit with the worldview, and you're almost having to, yeah, I completely understand what you mean. So something that feels just, this isn't necessarily the focus of the conversation, but just felt like I wanted to mention it. I hadn't realized at the time it happened, but I had a kind of, I guess, almost like spontaneous sort of spiritual awakening. I don't like to call it that normally, but it's the simplest way of describing it. When my dad died in 2012. And so he was killed. And so it was a very kind of like sudden tragic event. And it just blew me open spiritually. And it was only sort of years later, I realized this kind of significance around 2012. And I was just looking at kind of what you'd said about, these prophecies, and recognizing that actually a lot of people that I've spoke to in this line of work, in quote marks, often did have a kind of particular experience that happened in 2012 that I think we can take these prophecies like really literally, like the end of the world, rather than, as I think you were suggesting, like the end of a certain type of consciousness or awareness or way of living, and an opening to something else. So before we go into the conversation about DMT, I'd love to know if there's anything that you've seen around that in terms of individuals having that experience in 2012 that would align with what I've just said.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely saw many people go through, retrospectively, recognize that as a very key point in their journey. I mean, it's a 5,125-year cycle. So, it's kind of like the hinge point of a shift. I mean, I wasn't really ever proposing that was going to be like the moment, that shift would happen, so we're like 10 years in, that's like nothing when you're looking at a 5,000-year cycle. The global ecological emergency is amping up, the geopolitical crisis is amping up, like our whole civilizational structure seems to be kind of like trembling, if not crumbling. Which could be the end, or it could be the beginning of a new way of being, and hopefully it's the latter. So but definitely, many people felt that it was a hinge point for them personally.
Yeah, fascinating. It really is. So actually, that feels like quite a nice segue into the conversation about DMT, in that, how do you see, if we are agreeing there is this kind of shift or invitation or opening into a new way of being, how do you see, and maybe first even just having a definition of how you would describe DMT, but what I'd like to know, so is first, how would you define DMT? And then also, what role do you see it has to play in this shift into a new way of being?
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously there's a number of different psychedelic compounds that appear in nature. Many of them produced by plants, some of them produced by animals, like the toad produces a form of DMT in Mexico. And so there's psilocybin, obviously produced by mushrooms, peyote, and dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, is produced by a wide range of plants in the Amazon. It's the sort of one of the two main plants of the ayahuasca brew, which you find used across the whole Amazon basin by hundreds of tribes, hundreds of different cultures, and so on. And we've also learned that DMT is a chemical in our brain that's found in the spinal cord also. One of the initial works in the field a few years ago was DMT, the spirit molecule, by this guy, Dr. Rick Strassman. And he was one of the first, because basically after the 70s, you were not allowed to do human tests with psychedelics anymore. For some reason, it was like I think it was the 90s or early 2000s, he got approval to do a test with DMT, giving it to subjects intravenously. But his hypothesis around it came from studying Buddhism, because he discovered that according to Buddhism, the soul reincarnates after death, 7 weeks after death. Then he discovered that the pineal gland, which is the sort of distinct organ in the middle of the brain that Descartes thought was like the seat of the soul, and actually in other animals like reptiles and so on, it actually has like an evolutionary third eye, a lens and a cornea and so on. The pineal gland appears 7 weeks after conception. So that led him to this hypothesis that maybe there was like a chemical conductive medium that was produced by the pineal gland, which would bring the soul into the body when we're born and then release the soul at death. So that's one hypothesis. Yeah.
That's fascinating. A kind of slight segue. I was diagnosed with autism last year, so a year and a half ago. And around the same time, I was reading various research studies about autism and the autistic brain and the differences in it. And one of the studies said that it was looking at it much more from a kind of like medical, what's wrong here? How do we treat it? But the thing that was really interesting was they discovered that the autistic brain hypermetabolizes the DMT that's naturally found in the brain. Whether or not that also hypermetabolizes if you intake it, I don't know. Again, that wasn't the focus of the study. And it can be seen that in an autistic person's urine, the level of DMT present, and it's actually several types of DMT. It's not just one kind either. It has, I think it's the same type as the bufo-toad and another kind, I can't remember what that is. But it's actually found in like a higher percentage in the urine, which I thought was fascinating. I was like, so it clearly, as you're suggesting, it has some kind of role in humans, and the fact that in certain kinds of humans, it appears that it's potentially creating a different kind of human experience. I find that fascinating. I can make kind of various, I've got sort of a hypothesis as to what that might mean, but I'd love to know if there's any thoughts you have on that, because again, that was, I think, fairly recent research. And I think it's, as you're saying, it's not that long that we've even known that DMT is naturally present in the human brain anyway, is that?
Yeah, I don't know when we learned that. I mean, I think that DMT was synthesized in the 20s. I don't know when they learned where, the biological aspects of it. No, that is interesting. I don't really, I haven't researched a lot into autism, so I wouldn't know what that would mean in terms of that. Yeah. I mean, we don't really know like what DMT does for plants. It might be for some insects kind of a poison, or maybe it's meant for us to find it and chop it up and smoke it. Who knows?
Yeah. And it's fascinating when we look at something like ayahuasca that requires the combination of two different plants in that way. And I find these things so fascinating. It's simpler when it's something, well, I remember reading recently, I can't remember where I read this, it was saying that actually most forms of DMT come with a kind of an element of, challenge or danger. So for example, with psilocybin, there's all manner of mushrooms that are poisonous. And so you're needing to risk your life in order to find the ones that aren't. And it was saying, similarly, there's lots of other, with each type, there's various challenges that come with it. Like, for example, the peyote, it requires kind of pilgrimaging into the desert, which obviously is a dangerous environment. So it is an interesting thing, isn't it? Whether the plants, it's with the design that they are meant to be consumed by humans or not. I don't know. But yeah, I find that a fascinating thing. It feels like we evolved with them, but how they consider their role is a question mark.
Yeah. This weekend I've been hanging out a bit with Dennis McKenna, who was the Terence McKenna, an ethnobotanist, and he was talking about mushrooms and psilocybin potentially being sort of like neural hormones.
Mhm.
So the psilocybin, propagates itself through our use of it. So it actually it's found its own evolutionary pathway by creating these compounds that make us excited, delirious, maybe stimulate, language and other processes.
Fascinating. So coming back again to that second question I asked, what do you see that role? And I'm saying DMT because it's the best way of kind of generalizing. It could be, I guess, saying, psychedelic medicines. What do you see is its role in this movement to this opening to a new way of being?
Well, I mean, certainly when I wrote Breaking Open the Head, I was extremely hopeful that ayahuasca might accomplish what LSD didn't accomplish in the 60s. Often when people first take ayahuasca, they definitely, kind of level up in certain ways. They see their patterns, like negative thought patterns and behavior patterns. They also see their disconnection from nature. A lot of I have a friend who brings a lot of CEOs of startups to do ayahuasca in Peru, and a lot of times they'll then change what their company does or change their investment practice or start a different company that does something better for the environment or something. So it does have that, but then also, people who do it a lot learn how to sort of control it in a way. Like they figure out their own internal mechanisms, and so if their ego kind of assimilated again. And certainly in the Amazon, you find a lot of black magic, a lot of shamans who use, ayahuasca to, attack other shamans or sorcerers or whatever. So it's not that simple. But I still feel it. I'm kind of. I've also had slightly mixed because now there's this huge psychedelic renaissance. There's all this money for and actually I'm excited because the next few days I'm going to be spending in England actually with a lot of people who are part of this field, the science side and even on the corporate and investment side. So hopefully I'll get a much better sense of it. I've sort of stepped away from it for a while, but I've been a little concerned around, well, it was so weighted towards, science and research into mental health that they've kind of just been looking at psychedelics either as kind of therapy tools to, or as the microdosage use for corporations, for entrepreneurs to become more successful and innovative and so on. Whereas I think there's other levels of it, that are, maybe interest me more. I mean, both the fact that it can trigger these kind of paranormal or psychic effects, or the, transcendent quality of the experience.
Yeah. And my own sense is that I'm not saying this is wholly missing, but certainly in examples you gave with a sort of therapy focus and that kind of, Silicon Valley type microdosing focus is the relationship with the plants themselves, with the medicine, with the natural world. And clearly they're finding that there's efficacy in using these substances in that way, but it feels as though there's a deeper opportunity, a deeper relationship that's missed when it isn't then, I guess, do those experiences then start to invite someone into that relationship? Or does that worldview almost need to come first, if that makes sense? Let me know if I've not made that clear, but that's what I've been pondering recently.
There's a lot of debate and discussion around that in like the larger psychedelic community, with some people feeling very strongly that the ceremonial use of plants is really the crucial thing, and others feeling that it's actually this sort of chemical molecular experience that can be conveyed without a lot of ceremony or in a therapy context. What I like about the latter is, I mean, I personally believe that we're marching towards, global, sort of economic collapse and ecological, meltdown and so on. And I think people who have been trapped in the mainstream materialist society are going to be very confused, and they're going to be looking for new answers in a way, new ideas. And if you can make, for instance, an ayahuasca pharmaceutical product that a therapist can give out, with a license to quite a large number of people at one time in a kind of group therapy context, having gone through the legalization or whatever the regulation process to get that legalized, I think that might be a great thing, because it might convey enough of the experience, and I don't think it's in violation of like the plant spirit or anything to do that. Because ayahuasca in particular has an antidepressant quality to it. It also has this revelatory quality. So you can really imagine. I'm talking about this because I'm meeting people who are developing this in Switzerland, like a sort of pharmaceutical grade, sort of very. Because the other thing about ayahuasca is when you just drink the cup of it, you don't know exactly how much you're getting. This will be completely like you'll be getting 6 milligrams of DMT and 12 milligrams of beta carboline or whatever it is that potentiates the DMT. They'll be able to. So I actually think that, considering where we are now, if we can pull this into the framework of science and medicine, it's probably the best thing we can do.
Yeah, I really hear you on those two different schools of thought about it. I guess the question I have is, it feels as though, I'm not saying this is really simplifying a very complex thing, admittedly, but for me, so much of how we've ended up where we are is that disconnection with the natural world. And my own sort of journey to this point has been kind of like, so for example, my shamanic path has been much more around that connection with the natural world, with the ancestors. And then the working with plants has been kind of like an evolution from that rather than the other way around. And the more time I've experienced what that's given me, the more I feel as though that's really kind of, I don't know, I really get what you're saying. Like, we've got a kind of we're in an acute place, and maybe being able to kind of medicalize and scienticize these substances maybe is what's needed right now. But it feels to me that without, one way or another, coming back into connection with the natural world, I don't know how much can really change. And so I suppose for me, taking those medicines out of the natural world and out of us being in deeper connection with the natural world feels as though, is it really shifting anything?
I mean, I think it could. I mean, MDMA is a chemical compound, although it relates to certain compounds found in plants, and they're doing stage 3 clinical trials that are showing a huge amount of efficacy for treating like post-traumatic stress disorder, even in kind of a hardcore PTSD where people have like treatment-averse forms of PTSD. So they have like it's like 60% success rate in like curing treatment-averse PTSD. So that's like unheard of. So if that can get out to all the veterans, who are suffering, and they can actually start their lives again and have a new vision, and that's got to be great. I mean, LSD is also a chemical compound that related to compounds in other plants, or fungi or whatever, but that was discovered in the lab, in the 40s. But definitely inspired a lot of people to go back to the land, and a lot of creativity. The whole, a lot of the 60s movements, the ecological movement, were very influenced by, even the synthetic psychedelic experiences produced through something like LSD. So I don't think, I think we have to, I mean, they're all given to us by the earth in a way. Like, I mean, so if we can figure out what tools are best to help people right now, I think that would be the thing to do.
Yes, you're right. There's a systemic level, and then there's a kind of individual human level, but clearly they're interlinked. And if we can help things at the human level, ultimately, I'm guessing they'll lead to a shift at the systemic level.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the problems, for instance, with ayahuasca at the moment is that, because it's a limited source and most people do it, with these sort of shamans, it's become a very elite kind of opportunity. Like, I'm here in Pisa right now, and there are a lot of people here who explore ayahuasca and ceremony and other things like that. But you're not going to find that in Detroit or in Brixton or something. You know what I mean? So how do we get these kind of elevating experiences that maybe give people new context and help them address their life quandaries, who aren't already part of like an elite group.
Yes, no, that's a really good point. So this is quite a big question I'm about to ask you. What do you see is actually happening when someone takes some form of DMT? What do you see is actually happening for them? What's happening? Why is that happening as it is? Like, what do you see? And feel free to be as kind of, I guess, really based on your own experience. This doesn't have to be kind of scientific. I'm just really interested in understand what your sense of this is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have my perspective, which is maybe more mystical. So I sometimes, butt heads with people who are more in the scientific community. I mean, I think we're a very young species, and there's a lot that we don't know. I mean, do you know what percentage of the universe is made of dark matter and dark energy? Take a guess.
Oh my God, I don't. I'm panicking now because I'm going to say something absolutely ridiculous.
I mean, it's something else.
88%.
That's pretty good. I'm very impressed. 95%. 95%.
Oh.
Yeah. So dark matter and dark energy, our mathematics don't work there. Our physics don't work there. We basically know nothing about it. And that's 95% of the universe. So this idea that we have science, that we've almost got it all figured out, and we're just about to figure out the consciousness and how how the hard problem of consciousness, that could be totally wrong, and there might actually be a lot of other dimensions of reality and hyper interdimensional spatial other things and astral planes and etheric planes. So my feeling is that N-Dimethyltryptamine, when you take a high dose of it, it's like a hyperdimensional experience. You find yourself on another plane of existence, another plane of consciousness, and there seem to be entities, many people that are beings or entities there that are kind of watching or in communication or don't don't really care, but you used to have the sense of these beings having tremendous power and wisdom and intellect and so on. Then with the other DMT, that's N-Dimethyltryptamine, the 5-MeO-dimethyltryptamine. It's more of the void or the nirvana experience. The 5-MeO is the one that comes from the bufo toad and other places. So there you will have like an ego dissolution. When you begin to come out of it, you might remember it as like kind of, it looks a little bit like Islamic patterning from mosques or whatever. It's like those types of patterns. They're going in all directions for eternity, these sort of crystalline white patternings. But it's not like you're just looking at those patterns. You are that like infinite thing. So, Buddhism talks about non-duality being the ultimate basis of everything. So, when you smoke a 5-MeO-DMT at the ultimate level of that experience, there is experience, there is this ecstatic bliss state, but there's no you having that experience. There is just experience. So, you can either take that as sort of shocking and horrifying. It's like, oh no, there's no such thing as a self. Or you can take it as like, acceptance and blissful, and the basis of the universe is love, and we're all connected as one in this cosmic nirvana and so on. So I mean, I think that the 5-MeO is experiential confirmation of the Buddhist idea of the nirvana or the void, and the N-Dimethyltryptamine is kind of like drops us into a subtler plane of manifestation, like a different hyperdimensional reality. So that's the best I can say.
No, I love that. Yeah. So kind of different kinds, or like a doorway into a different realm, different plane.
Yeah, there's really only those two kinds of DMT as far as I know.
Yeah. And so from how you see it, those planes are there, and it's something that happens in like our usual consciousness that doesn't allow us to experience them. And when we take DMT, it opens us up to experience them. Would that roughly summarize it?
Yeah. I mean, a number of traditions have what are called dark retreats, where they put people, into a total black environment, like under a cave or something, but like for weeks. And it may be that is sort of stimulates DMT production, and then leads them to, in meditations, have like similar type of experiences. I think it's possible that you can reach those places, just through intense meditation and different practices, breathing practices, and so on. But a few days ago, I had an opportunity to chat with a Tibetan Rinpoche, and he said that he would never do these substances. That they don't feel that they would need them, that they can reach these experiences in other ways. And I think he's probably correct.
Yes, I don't know if have you ever come across any studies that I don't know how you would do this, but it'd be really interesting to be able to measure the metabolism of DMT in the brain of someone who's, for example, a long-term meditator.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, actually, my friend is organizing right now some studies at Imperial College where they are sort of giving people DMT and putting this whole, like, all these electrodes on their heads, like looking at their, brain waves and what happens and so on. And yeah, I assume that some of the people going through it have dedicated spiritual practices and so on. Yeah, that's actually what I was suggesting to the Tibetan Lama. I was like, look, maybe you would want to come and do this this experience. And he was like, not for me,
Yeah, don't need it, which does make real sense. Yeah.
But we are getting a lot more data. Like Imperial College has done all these like brain scans of people at high dose LSD and psilocybin, and you can really see, how profound these things are in terms of how they affect the brain. Like they light up all these areas of the brain that are normally dormant, and they create these kind of new connections across these areas and so on. So it makes sense that they would maybe lead to breakthroughs, like creative breakthroughs or new ideas or whatever.
Yeah, really does make sense. Actually, going back to what I was saying earlier about the studies on the autistic brain, there's two different things that were talked about in this study. One was that hypermetabolism of DMT. The other was what they called as a kind of overgrowth of the cortical, as in like there's almost too many connections. So it seems like one seems to link to the other. Who knows what causes what, but that kind of extra level of connectivity seems associated.
Interesting. Yeah, it's something I've really researched.
So what do you see is next in terms of, as you say, there's this kind of psychedelic renaissance and this explosion of studies and different forms of being able to access DMT. What do you see is coming next? What do you think is going to be a kind of, some important milestones that we've got ahead? And I guess there's almost like, what would you like to happen, and what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah. I mean, anything that's working through the system takes quite a bit of time, right? Like, I mentioned this sort of pharmaceutical version of ayahuasca. Legally that would be like, maybe 5-7 years away. That's a big shame because, I feel like we're entering the sort of crux emergency, in the next 2 or 3 years. But yeah, what would I like to see in which level, in which area?
I guess we talked about this opening into like the very nascent start of this new way of being that came about in 2012. And then we've been exploring, potentially the role of DMT in this.
Well,
and so,
okay.
yeah, so very specifically, kind of like what's required to move us into, assuming this new way of being is something desirable and beneficial, how you see, and you pick the time frame. We could be talking over the next 5-10 years, we could be talking longer, but kind of milestones in DMT role in that.
Okay. Well, I guess for me, something I've been writing a lot on my newsletter, which is danielpinchbeck.substack.com, if people want to join it, has been kind of the need to kind of realize that the materialist, the reductive scientific materialist model is obsolete. As quantum physics kind of discovered in the course of the 20th century, that actually, there isn't really an observed unless there's an observer making a observation, and this is now leading kind of a new group of philosophers to explore what's called analytic idealism, which is essentially kind of a restatement of a lot of Eastern ideas, but essentially the idea is that consciousness is actually the reality, the underlying and foundational reality. And what we experience is like matter and physical stuff is actually just projections of consciousness. Like you and I are like dreams that this consciousness is having. Like it can explore its like creative abilities and possibilities by separating itself out and creating these fragments, so then can get like reintegrated, what our little dream is. It's just as like a dream character in your dream. When you wake up, you're like, oh, that was interesting. That was me. And it wasn't me. And now I remember that dream. So that type of realization, if it began to, propagate itself through society, I think would be very transformative, because the scientific materialism has also led to this idea that the only thing that's worth valuing are things that are, like material, goods, comforts. It used to be that many societies, like indigenous cultures, weren't really interested in comfort and warmth in that way. They more saw life as a constant test of their kind of initiatory discipline, or as an opportunity to, become more psychic, or more, aware, or something like that. So, as we go into this crisis, we can either be like, oh no, oh shit, this is terrible. How could the world be doing this to us? And then we'll, also like, oh, we'll go for like fascist leaders because maybe they can hold stuff together. I don't know what to do anymore. Or there can be more of like a movement towards like, self-sovereignty, self-awareness, realization. And I think this paradigm shift would be part of it, from materialism.
So coming back to DMT, your sense is its role is one of the things that can most powerfully invite people into that worldview, let's call it, that non-dual experience.
I mean, it can, definitely can help people become aware of, I mean, there's actually, it's quite a big difference between, just smoking DMT or doing the ayahuasca. I mean, it seems that iboga, ayahuasca, and psilocybin ultimately all break down to DMT, in the brain. So you get similar type experiences, but DMT is extremely fast, and it's not very, a little bit cold. It's like there's so much going on in that other world that you can't really take it in, but it feels like, ayahuasca or psilocybin, and they're like allow us to kind of interface, like to have a slower level interface with this phenomena.
Yes, that makes sense. This is it's so fascinating to, I mean, going back to what you were saying about dark matter, it's kind of, we set sail in a conversation this kind, and there's so much that we just don't know. It's fun to hypothesize, but Yeah, there is so much still that is yet to be known. So if you could, is there something that we could, I don't know, a way that we could use DMT or study DMT or something of that nature? What would you, if you could have, you know, a genie that's kind of like going to make your wish come true, so very specifically about DMT and what we can find out about it, what would that wish be?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I do have this, I mean, next week I'm going to this conference in England. And as I said, I have a friend who's actually sponsoring this research. And he's extremely interested in, a lot of times when people drink ayahuasca or smoke DMT, as I said, they have a feeling that there's a sentient other, like a presence of something else. Sometimes there's even a communication, like you might, you know, be actually verbally told things, or get kind of instructions or whatever. So he's quite interested to see if it's somehow possible to establish whatever, you know, somehow objective knowledge, you know, that some scientific way to verify or validate that there are these entities in this hyperdimensional reality. He feels that would be really a game changer for the world.
Yeah, I literally had the same thought, like that really would be a game changer, because that would like literally completely change the worldview that mostly, I mean, there's clearly religions that do believe in, you know, there being particular entities, but certainly probably not that kind of entities. I think that would be incredible.
It would be. It's very difficult to figure out how you would create such an experiment that would satisfy, you know, a scientific-minded person. But yeah, I think just, you know, coming at it from different angles. You know, I mean, I'm also not like a. I mean, even though I wrote about psychedelics, I'm really, my interest is consciousness in you know, a larger sense. So, you know, I'm equally interested in like out of body experience. I'm working with a project where we want to send artists to go through this Monroe Institute, like out of body research kind of protocol, and then make art based on what they experience. I'm interested in like interspecies communication, like, you know, could we learn to communicate with like dolphins or plants? I mean, a lot of the Amazon cultures like the Shipibo, they have a lot of other plants besides ones that have DMT that they say are, you know, have wisdom, or master teacher plants that are conscious at some level. And then you can do these practices, these dhyānas, to gain knowledge from these other plants. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things out there that could really expand how we think about our world. Crop circles, another area. My 2012 book, I wrote about 100 pages about the crop circles in England. I spent 2 summers researching, and I think there's, you know, still good reason to think that there's some type of non-human agency that makes some of those formations and is clearly trying to communicate something to us, but we haven't really put the work in to figure out what that is, because it's so ridiculed and mocked. You know, I mean, that could be interesting in combination with DMT, maybe like you use the crop circles as portals or something, do experiments to see if that leads anywhere. I think you have to experiment with science, you know, like apparently, you know, they discovered electricity at the end of the 19th century. Then they didn't really know what to do with it. Like Benjamin Franklin put the kite up and it got hit by lightning or whatever. So they knew electricity was there. And it took like decades of like experiment and research. And they're like, oh, like we can like channel it, we can transmute it, we can like, you know, store it different in places. And then we changed the whole world, you know. So what idea that this scientist, Dean Radin, psychic scientist, kind of.
Oh, he'd come to mind just now, funny enough. I was going to quote something that he'd said. He's been a guest on the show previously, but carry on.
Yeah, no, basically his idea is that maybe we're at the place with psychic phenomena now that we were at with electricity at the beginning of the 19th century, where we like we need to become aware that there's like this incredible potential there, but we don't yet know how to make use of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason he'd come to mind was I was thinking it really does require people like him to be willing to kind of do things that others are going to think is absolutely ludicrous, you know, others in that wider scientific community are going to ridicule, be incredibly skeptical of. I remember him quoting, I can't remember who it is, saying something, like with extraordinary phenomena, extraordinary evidence is required, almost like when something's going beyond anything that we believe is possible, it requires this kind of extra weight of evidence. So you're kind of like, scientists that are in this work need to not only be willing to do things that other people just think is nonsense, but then, if they are able to show that it has any sort of basis, it has to almost be like a double whammy of evidence compared to a different study. So it's asking a lot, but, thank goodness there's people that are willing to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, I think needed right now.
Yeah.
So we are up on time. Where can listeners find out all about you and your amazing work and your books? Where can they find out all of that good stuff?
Sure. I mean, well, my most active kind of medium right now is the Substack newsletter. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love it if people joined up for that. danielpinchbeck.substack.com. I also have a bunch of courses that I teach, or archives of courses. That's at Liminal.news. And otherwise, I'm under my name at Twitter and Instagram. And if you look at my up on Amazon, there's tons of books there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. This has been, it's such a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for you and also just the work you're doing more broadly. Really needed. Wow, what a show. Here are my takeaways. Daniel described 2 schools of thought around the use of psychedelics, one ceremonial and one purely focused on their medical use. Given the wider benefits of modern humans reclaiming our connection to nature and the ancient practices of ceremony and ritual, if you're listening to the show, then I'd say you don't need to choose between those 2 options. You can have both. I loved what Daniel said about the ways that different spiritual traditions have practices such as darkness immersion and meditation that open humans to the kinds of experiences that taking DMT can create. Ultimately, all of these practices appear to be giving us an experience of reality beyond that of our ordinary human consciousness. There's a renaissance in the use of DMT in its various forms happening now, and we're discovering uses and benefits in all kinds of fields. As Daniel said, this could be akin to the period in which we discovered electricity and how to harness it. If you'd like to get notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, do hop on over to the show notes, and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 385. And as I said earlier, the next Waking the Wild Crucible to be opening is Waking the Wild Sovereign in early 2023. So if you are feeling the call to sovereignty and to actualizing your inner king or queen archetype, then do go register your interest and you'll be the first to hear when it opens for application. The link is primalhappiness.co/WTWS. And if you don't want to miss out on next week's episode, head on over to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or your app of choice, hit that subscribe button, and you will get each episode delivered auto-magically to your device as soon as it's released. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next week.